morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cities on the Frontline speaker series, and this session on building resilient communities through social justice. My name is Ron Harris, and I'm from the Resilient Cities Network, and I will be your co-host for today, as well as a panelist today, which is a very exciting thing for me on a very interesting topic and a topic near and dear to my heart for sure. And I'll be hosting today along with Camille Viros from OECD. Before we get started, let me give you a quick introduction to the series and to the ground rules. So the Cities on the Frontline is a virtual thought leadership speaker series featuring solutions by cities for cities. It began in 2020 through a partnership between the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank Group's City Resilience Program. The series provides city practitioners with a platform for knowledge exchange. This is the 10th session on the Cities on the Frontline speakers series this year, and it's hosted with the support of the Embassy of the United States of America, France, and co-hosted with OECD. This session is held in collaboration with partners France VA Durab and the World Bank. Before we start, let me remind everybody of the intentions of this speaker series and the ground rules for our conversation today. The purpose of these global seminars is to have an open and honest learning conversation. These calls are not on the record, and we ask that you not attribute any comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so. And we can, of course, help you obtain that permission if you so desire. We've had over 170 plus registered participants for the call today. So in order to facilitate today's conversation, we ask that you write your questions on the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to those as you write them. We also have simultaneous interpretation for today's webinar, and you can access the French and the English interpretation support if you need it. So to access this option in your meeting and your webinar controls on Zoom, click Interpretation and click the language that you'd like to hear. You'll also be able to hear the original audio at a low volume, but you can also choose to mute that low volume from the same tab. So to hear the interpreted language only, click Mute Original Audio. So again, to access the interpretation, make sure you click the interpretation button and the language you'd like to hear. You also hear the original language at a low volume, but you can choose to turn that off just to hear the interpreted language only. Please note that the recording of this session, as well as any PowerPoint presentations that might be presented today, will be posted by next week on our website. So now I will kindly invite Angie Mazur, who is the Deputy Cultural Affairs Officer for the U.S. Embassy in Paris, to share opening remarks. All right, over to you, Angie.
Thank you so much for this, and welcome everyone to the 7th session of this webinar series, Cities on the Frontline. Before starting, I would like to thank the Resilient City Network, the World Bank, organizing and just really creating and implementing this wonderful webinar that we here at the U.S. Embassy in France support. And we are so pleased to have so many speakers from El Paso, Texas, the National Agency for Urban Renewal in France, and of course the Resilient Cities Network community of practice. So you may notice I have no headset on. I'm actually doing this on my phone. I am so new to the embassy that I actually don't have Zoom on my computer. And this is the first event that I've had the privilege of launching in my time here in France. And I have to say, I am so thrilled. This important topic of social and environmental justice. So thank you so much for inviting me into this ongoing and wonderful program and to be a small part of it. As you well know, the U.S. mission in France, our role is, of course, to connect linkages and dialogue through the United States and France on key issues such as this one. And listening to Jared talk at the beginning was really great for me to hear about the history and the intent of this speaker program that is clearly impactful for so many communities that we're sharing and having this open and honest discussion, which is, really one of the cool things. Oh, with my phone. I told you I was on my phone. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Let me hold it. Just to have these open and honest discussions. I mean, what a great opportunity to learn from your peers, from colleagues, from experts all around the world. So it's really, really great to see. And one of the things that is so wonderful for us in our jobs as well, to create these discussions. So I don't want to stand in the way of this great discussion that I know is going to take place. So I'm just so pleased to see so many participants here who are ready to dive into this topic. And definitely, again, thank you for organizing. Thank you for inviting me. And I wish you a wonderful, open, and honest discussion about social justice and environmental issues. So have a wonderful time, and looking forward to hearing how it goes.
Thank you so much, Angie. And I will now introduce, I will introduce my co-host, Camille. Camille, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ron. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you also, Angie, for your opening remarks, and welcome to France. So I'm Camille Viros, and I'm the coordinator for the OECD Champion Mayors Initiative for Inclusive Growth, and I am actually based in Paris too. And I'm delighted to be with you today to discuss this crucial topic of how social justice can help build resilient communities. So why is this topic so important? In recent years, we have seen global movements across the world sparked by racial discrimination, with cities at the center of protests, but also of debates and transformative action. Many recent events have not only highlighted racial injustice, but also underscored the need for cities to be resilient in the face of social challenges. In North America, for example, recent overlapping public health and climate crises have further exposed the realities of systemic racism and the deep inequities faced by Black and Brown communities in many cities across the US. And these recent crises have also shown how these inequities have actually compounded the negative impacts of urban shocks. Across the Atlantic, in France, we have also been dealing with these inequities, and the country recently launched a 3-year national plan against racism, anti-Semitism, and ethnic discrimination. And this plan provides a series of measures across different sectors such as education, employment, and justice. France has also identified the so-called priority neighborhoods, which are the urban areas with the greatest social difficulties. And these neighborhoods are being transformed through interventions in housing, for example, but also by promoting social diversity and collaboration with all stakeholders. So the session today will therefore explore how cities address racial and social challenges and how they can leverage the principles of social justice to foster community resilience and inclusive growth. And to discuss this topic today, we are very fortunate to have with us first Nicole Ferrini. Nicole is the Chief Resilience Officer and the Climate and Sustainability Officer for the city of El Paso in the US. In 2014, she became the first Latina in the world to serve as Chief Resilience Officer for a municipal government. And in her multiple leadership roles, she has continued to raise the bar for city leadership by provoking innovation among civic leaders, industry professionals, and the community at large. She's also remained focused on building grassroots resilience across the Paso del Norte region by promoting solutions related to climate instability, urban development, homelessness, and social justice. Thank you very much, Nicole, for being with us today. And we are also delighted to welcome Laila Haddag. Laila is the project manager for international cooperation at the French National Agency for Urban Renewal, ANRU. She works on the deployment of the agency's national programs to support local authorities in their urban regeneration projects. These projects aim to reduce territorial inequalities in France, including in the overseas departments. And Laila is also working on a partnership with the French Development Agency, the AFD, to provide technical assistance to developing countries and cities in their challenges of urban renewal and social spatial inequalities. Thank you very much, Laila, for taking the time to be with us today. So I think now we can now start with the first panel discussion, and Ron, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Angie. And before I dive into this conversation with Nicole, who I am super proud to be a colleague with, for myself as a former Chief Resilience Officer in the city of Minneapolis, Nicole is also a member of our Racial Equity Through Resilience Community of Practice. That community of practice is made up of 28 plus cities in the United States and Canada who are really focused on advancing this conversation about racial equity, leveraging our roles as resilience practitioners. That group has been around for about 3 years, and it started after the tragic murder of George Floyd, which happened in my city, of course. And the thing I want to say about that is after the tragic murder of George Floyd, it was amazing to see this resilience community come together and take a stand and recognize that they and we play a very important and significant role in this conversation about justice for Black and Brown communities. And there are a couple of people from that community of practice that I'll just mention that are here. Jenny from Calgary is here. Thank you so much for being here. I've got some friends from Minneapolis who are also on the call. Kelsey, others, thanks so much for joining us today. So, Nicole, the first Latina woman to become a Chief Resilience Officer on the planet. So good to see you today. We will dive right in.
Morning, Ron. How are you?
I'm excellent. How are you doing today?
Very good. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. Something that you and I have talked about quite a bit, and I'd love to bring that conversation to this discussion is, the unique opportunities and challenges that come with your city of El Paso being right on the border with Mexico. You share more similarities with, Juarez in Mexico than some U.S. cities. And so can you share a little bit more about some of those challenges and also the unique opportunities that come with that? And also, how does that shape your city's culture and its identity, and what does that actually mean for resilience?
A lot of questions, my friend, but I'm gonna try to tackle them for you, and then let's have a conversation. So I think first I want to call y'all's attention to the image behind me right now, because what you are looking at is my beautiful city. And I shouldn't say cities or city, but I should say cities, because what you are looking at is actually both the city of El Paso, Texas, in the United States, as well as Ciudad Juarez in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. And we are a community of family. We're a community that is connected. We're divided by an international border, but that's a man-made barrier. That is what I would call an artificial barrier. We are very much one community. We're the largest binational metroplex in the Western Hemisphere. This is something that folks don't know. If you take a look at this entire region, we sit at the cradle of 3 states and 2 countries. We function as one region. As you heard mentioned during my bio, we refer to ourselves as the Paso del Norte. That came about because throughout history, this region has been utilized to create transportation, connection, trade, cultural exchange. I mean, everything that you can think of is brought through this region. And so this becomes a confluence of all of that. And so it really starts to shape, to your question, Ron, the way that we look at not only ourselves and our community, but the way we look outward at the world. We see ourselves as very connected to another country. Someone asked me one time when I was very young, when I was about 16 or 17 years old, if I'd ever visited another country. And at that time, I'd never been on a plane and left to, say, for example, Europe or Australia or Asia. So I answered the question. I said, no, I've never been to another country. And they said, well, don't you live on the border? I said, oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, so from where I'm sitting right now, Ron, I could take about a 15-minute walk and I would be in Ciudad Juarez. And so when I say that we're connected, I truly mean it. And I think that being on the border, it's interesting. We're talking about being cities on the front line. The border in Spanish is referred to as la frontera, right? We are on the front line. And so I think that there's an opportunity to learn a lot from the way that we grapple with challenges in this community. We tend to do it from a familial place. We do it from a multicultural place, but we also do it from a place of understanding. And so I would say that's the basis of how we build resilience in our community, both of them.
appreciate that. And so you talk about this basis of understanding of family or familiarity, and certainly culture and identity play a role in that. Another thing that we've talked about is that I think is oftentimes missing in resilience, and one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to it is the human aspect of this work, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to be resilient as a community without recognizing the humanity that exists within us and among us. And, we have this conversation about the environment, and people are always talking about, we have to take care of our place, and we have to take care of the places that we're in. And I say, well, you can't care about a place if you don't care about the people that are in it, right?
You hit it on the head, Ron. You hit it right on the head. I mean, it's all about humanity, right? And how we view each other, and then look at our similarities and the things that we share more so than the things that make us incredibly different from each other. But then even those things that make us different, we can embrace and listen for understanding and look at it from a human standpoint. I'm glad you brought it up, because I've been a chief resilience officer for almost 10 years now. And when I first started, it was all about environment. Everybody said resilience, but what they meant was climate action.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of us in those early days were brought on because we had a skill set in that space. But when I started working on the resilience strategy for El Paso, I realized, I said, do an asset scan, figure out what your greatest assets are. I said, well, I don't have to do a scan to tell you that. El Paso's greatest asset has always been, is today, and will always be her people. Always. And so everything had to start there. And so I spent the last 10 years really pushing back on this idea that resilience is about place.
That's right.
It's about people and how they exist in a place and with each other.
That's right. That's right. And when you think about people as assets, one thing that I've really worked on in this resilience work in other spaces is instead of viewing our communities as problems to be solved, we view them as partners and assets in solving the solutions. If we continue to look at our communities as disadvantaged, at risk, vulnerable, marginalized, how can we ever even consider them as part of the solution?
Exactly right, Ron. I think, that's another really interesting thing about being on the border, right? Is that if you watch, I'm going to say American news. If you watch the news in the United States, what you see when you hear the word El Paso is the migrant crisis. You see these pictures of, border walls and razor wire and other things. And that's really, really unfortunate, because that is not what our community looks like. That is an extremely tunnel vision view of what our community looks like. And it puts us at a deficit. It views these challenges as these insurmountable problems, like you say. I think that this is all an opportunity. Whether we're talking about migration or we're talking about what it means to grapple with, the laws and regulatory structures of 3 states and 2 countries. If I'm dealing with something as straightforward as air quality, it's not straightforward, because we share it across all of those regulatory barriers, and folks will attack those challenges at a deficit, to your point. And I'm saying no. This just means we have more resources, more brain power, more resources in our people and in our community because of where we are. So it's not a deficit, it's an asset.
And that's something that we need to promote, something that's so unique about the place that you're in, 3 different states, 2 different countries, multiple cultural identities, all these opportunities. Those are the kind of people that I want on my team, right? The folks who've had to navigate certain things like that. And when I think about what's happened in Minneapolis 3 years ago and since then, the folks who are watching the news and CNN and the American news, like you say, all they saw was the rioting and the burning of buildings and the chaos. But what people didn't see, and I talk about this often, is they didn't see community members come together with very, very little resources on their own, but coming together and having an abundance of resources. They were making sure that people were fed during the protest. They were making sure that emergency services couldn't get into certain neighborhoods because of so much of the unrest. Well, community members came together and organized their own ambulatory services in the back of vans if people needed to go back and forth to the hospital. I remember, helping at the city, helping to support folks putting together their own transit for making sure that the elderly had access to their medicines. And so when you position people to be a part of the solution, it's amazing to see the kind of benefits that come with that. And the other part of this too, right, as a city practitioner, for us to think about is, instead of waiting until something bad happens to start to funnel a bunch of resources to the challenge or the issue, what if we start to resource communities ahead of time, right, during what we call the sunny days before the rainy days, so that when the rainy days come, they have enough of a container and enough set of resources and assets to be able to navigate through that challenge.
You know what, you're right. And I'm just going to make a little bit of a joke in that El Paso has 300 plus sunny days a year. So anybody, if y'all want to visit the Sun City, I say that's, you know, we actually do, that's what our weather looks like. But I mean that in the context of what you're saying, Ron, is that we approach our community, we approach our challenges through the lens of those sunny days. You know, we are, I think, when I talk about our familial culture, it really positions us to humanize those that enter into our community, whether they're here to stay here permanently or they're passing through, or if it's about our community interfacing with another community that, you know, needs support. I'm going to take us to two really big events that, you know, folks watching the news might have heard about El Paso. The first I've already mentioned is, you know, the crossing of the migration of human beings from primarily South America through El Paso to other places in the United States. The first thing that I tell everyone is that I really don't like when we talk purely about the numbers. You know, 1,000 migrants. Well, when you say 1,000 migrants or 10,000 migrants, however many you're talking about, you're homogenizing human beings. And what I see when I get in my car and I drive to work, or I'm walking around downtown, which is literally on the hip of the US-Mexico border, which is where these folks are primarily at, families, moms, dads, brothers, sisters. I see young people on their own. These are human beings. And so I think that what starts to happen when we start to look too much at data points is that we start to dehumanize the challenge. We dehumanize what's happening. And so it becomes easier to create policy that, you know, is simply about brushing it aside and not being resilient, as you mentioned, Ron. With the challenge with migration, this is not a new thing. Right. This has been happening, at least on my watch, since 2018. And we see it happen every single year. And we should not be surprised at this point. We should not be utilizing emergency resources to do it, because at this point, it's something that happens very consistently. I'll give you a little bit of data, even though I just said data was dangerous. Data allows us to really be cold about something. And I think we need to challenge ourselves in that space. But from April of 2022 to September of 2022, 62,000 people crossed through this community from South America on foot. Can you imagine walking from South America to the US-Mexico border?
No.
I know people that won't walk, you know, 35 feet from a far parking space to the front door of a building, you know? And so we need to be cognizant of what these folks have been through and what challenges. What I have seen on the faces of some of these migrants that are, you know, in our community right now, they look hopeful. They're on the street, they're in a shelter, they have next to nothing, and I see hope on their faces. And you know why? Because what we would consider the worst of what we deal with, not having a house, not having access to food, not having an income, all of those things that we would consider devastating. The worst of what we have is better than the best of what they left.
Say it again.
You can see it. And so those things are, by recognizing that, we're able to sort of catalyze a different approach to the kind of assistance that we would offer. The second thing, without going, you know, too long, and this goes back to something that's really difficult for me to talk about. It goes back to August 3rd, 2019. On August 3rd, 2019, a white supremacist from Central Texas drove 10 hours because he wanted to murder people in El Paso. That's domestic terrorism. I don't care what anybody wants to call it. That was racially targeting an entire community. And that was made possible because of the dehumanization of an entire race of people. This idea of those people on the border, those people flooding our country, those people, who are those people? We are those people. We have faces, we have names. George Floyd, we need to say his name over and over again so that we never forget. When we remember the victims of August 3rd, 23 people died that day. When we remember them every year, we don't talk about the 23 people, we talk about their names. We remember their faces. And that's what I would encourage everyone to do as you approach resilience building in your community. Those folks that are crossing the border, those families that are recovering from that domestic terror event, no one is more resilient than they are.
I appreciate that, Nicole. And before we shift to Camille, I'll say one more thing, which is we talk so much about the dehumanizing of people and the impacts to the resilience of the community when we dehumanize them. Yeah. And I'm of the opinion that if we can dehumanize a people, right, through not naming them, through calling them those people, by putting them in boxes, we can also rehumanize them by naming who they are, by honoring their agency, by supporting them to be able to shape the outcome of their own lives, which ultimately builds longer term resilience, I think, for not only our communities, but for the broader city. So we will come back to that in a little bit. Nicole, thank you so much for that conversation. Camille, we will shift over to you.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you so much also, Nicole, for your insights. And now for the second panel, I'm really glad that we are having a conversation also with Laila from ANRU, the French National Agency for Urban Renewal. And my first question to you, Laila, is how do you define, we've heard a lot about resilience already for the past 25 minutes or so. How do you define resilient communities in the context of social justice through the lens of your work at the French National Agency for Urban Renewal?
Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Ron. And thank you to the Resilient City Network to give me this opportunity to talk about ANRU and urban regeneration in France and how the national programs can contribute to to build resilient neighborhoods and communities. So ANRU supports, as you say, since 20 years now, the local authorities in the deployment of their large-scale urban regeneration projects to reduce territorial inequalities in France. Just for the context of France since 1970s, France has seen an increasing number of neighborhoods with severe urban dysfunctions. People living in this district are facing significant social problems like unemployment and health problems, but also suffer from problems related to town planning aspect, like houses that could be damaged or unfit for residents, and also difficulties to access shops, activity, employment, and healthcare. In 2003, the law for cities and urban regeneration was enacted in France to reduce the development gaps in the territory. By acting on several aspects, housing and urban environment, but also employment and health and education. This law created the public establishments called ANRU, whose mission is to contribute to the realization of, as I say, of regeneration by granting financial assistance to the municipal councils and their priority neighborhoods. So the priority neighborhoods also were selected by ministerial decree on the proposal of the ANRU board on the basis of qualitative analysis on their situations, that is to say state of social housing stock, diversification of housing, but also functional diversity, mobility, land mutability, and urban environment. For information, the first program started in 2004 and had 12 billion euros budgets and covered approximately 600 neighborhoods. And the second program started in 2014 and have also a 12 billion euros budget. So it's very important. These two programs marked the physical phase of the urban policy, trying to correct the issue of social segregation and its roots via the demolition and of damaged social housing and its reconstruction, of course. There is, and in fact, it's important to notice that the action supported by the agency is a massive intervention in housing, but also the implementation of public facilities like schools, parks, libraries for opening up the neighborhoods and facilitate the access of the rest of the urban area.
Okay. Well, thanks, Laila. And I think what's very interesting in what you describe is how you select these urban areas that are very deprived, and how you put in place all these actions across lots of sectors, such as housing, transport, education. And I think that's what makes the particularity of this program and what makes it really interesting, and how you build these resilient communities. So thank you very much for explaining us how you work at ANRU. And I also understand that these projects aim to promote social diversity in these neighborhoods. And I was wondering, how does ANRU prevent the risk of token participation and ensure genuine engagement from the marginalized communities?
Yes, it's important to notice that the participation of the residents is very important in these two national programs. So between the first and the second program, the agency wanted to improve the process of participation of the residents. So the feedback that we have from the first program shows that there is a great diversity of participatory actions led by cities. So at different times of the implementation of the Urban Renewal project, with actions that have been globally built on isolated objects and without an overall strategy between the project leader and the other stakeholders. Also, the participation in the first program, we noticed that the residents, it's a participation of the residents is essentially took the form of information and communication. So with initiative like urban workshop or and citizen juries. And finally, the consideration of the diversity of uses and users could be quite low in this first program, with participation about limited perimeter of the district and focused on the oldest residents of or those who need to came to the renewed district. So it was this is the result of the first program, but with the second national program of ANRU, we move from a process of consultation to a process of co-construction of the projects. So this is a strong principle that is written in the law of 2014. That law creates the second program of ANRU. So the residents, the users, the association and citizen council must now be associated in the Urban Renewal project. So this principle is also enshrined in the general regulation of ANRU, which establishes the co-construction with the residents at all the stages of the project, as to say, from the diagnosis to the orientations and the implementation and the evaluation of the project. This co-construction is based on the establishment of citizen councils. In addition, in each district, a project house allows residents to obtain information and monitor operations and exchange with project leaders and the elected official of the municipality. So this ambition of co-construction no longer considers the residents only as a beneficiary of the project, as a contributor of and full actor in the same way as the other stakeholders, like the project leader or the project owners. But this development of co-construction is not without limits and raises cultural and organizational questions. So, for example, we can regret that the low representation of other local actors of the neighborhoods, like social centers, some association or user representative who can also bring their knowledge of the neighborhoods. And users that can mobilize also the residents and federate initiative. So this is a lake of also of the co-construction and the participation we promote at ANRU. And yes, it's a challenge for us for the next years to improve these second national programs to support by specific training the professionals who are implemented this project.
Thanks, Laila. I think it's very interesting how you showed that you came from a communication perspective to really the co-creation, and I think it echoed also very beautifully with what Nicole said earlier, that having the citizens not only as beneficiaries or the recipients of the policies, but really as the partners and the co-creators of the policies and the measures. And I think that's very interesting. And thank you also for highlighting the challenges. And I'd be interested also to hear maybe a bit later how, so you identified the challenge of having really having everyone really participate in this co-creation, and some specific groups of population sometimes being more difficult to have with you in the project. So maybe be interesting to hear from you later how you are targeting these groups in particular. So I think now we can turn to our third panel of discussion, and it will be a discussion between Ron, Laila, and Nicole. So we've heard from the examples of El Paso. Thanks, Nicole, for all your insights, and from Laila, also the example of ANRU in France. And I'd be really interested in hearing from you. And we've seen from your interventions how there are lots of similarities in what you've been saying. Although it's very different context, of course. And I'd like to hear from you three. What are your key takeaways, maybe, and what are the best practices from your experiences that could be, shared with other cities on how to build resilience through social justice?
I'll answer quickly. I'll kick that one off. Thanks for the question, Camille. One of the things that I think city practitioners may forget or may ignore is that Dr. King said this, that a riot is the language of the unheard. And when people are out protesting, when people are out making noise, when people are out gathering and demonstrating, they're really upset about something, right? That people aren't just doing this because it's fun to do. It's because there's somebody not paying attention that needs to be paying attention. And so if we can look at that as practitioners and recognize that when communities come together in the face of injustice or other experiences that are they're experiencing as negative, we need to pay closer attention and see what are they really saying. When I was a chief resilience officer in Minneapolis, I viewed my role as a translator. I would translate information from the city to the community, like, hey, here's what's going on, here are the resources, here are the opportunities. But I'll also translate back to leadership what community was talking about. They were protesting and demonstrating about this, but really this is what they're talking about and this is what they mean. And so, when you think about this kind of building community resilience, it's both taking actions to recognize the agency of the voices of the people that are using them, and then using our platforms to both translate those things, and also sometimes getting a little bit of good trouble by amplifying and elevating those voices as well. I got in a lot of trouble at City Hall when I was there, often for elevating some of those voices, because I'm like, hey, we're not listening. And so that's a major thing for us to pay attention to.
Ron, I'm just going to jump in right there and say, this is why we have been good friends since like the first 30 seconds we met. I think you said a couple of things that are really, really important. If an issue has escalated to the point of the riot, the march, the protest, you have already not been listening, and you have already pushed a community to a point where they are likely no longer listening. And I think that that's when we get into a lot of trouble, because you start to see the bad trouble, Ron, not the good trouble. Because I think I have often been told by my leadership that I should have the word trouble tattooed somewhere. But I think that the bad trouble is that you start to be reactionary to that. And I think we saw that, across our country, where, you see people taking to the streets and they're demanding action. In a lot of cases, there's not a lot of specificity about what that action should be. It's because it's a reaction to being ignored. So then on the flip side, you have governments reacting in the moment to deal with whatever is right in their face. And that is when you make non-resilient decisions. That is when you make decisions that are not well vetted, well thought out, well debated. And I think that I talk a lot, even with my internal staff, my team, about listening for understanding is step one. Step two is listening with the frame of, I can be convinced that I'm wrong. I don't know a lot of people that can do that. I myself am guilty of really getting on a high horse about something and being unconvincible. Well, you cannot move forward as a community if you're in that space. You cannot resolve the challenges that we face or the disagreements that we have. And so I think that I was answering a question in the chat about whether resilience could be preventative. It has to be proactive. If you've waited till, someone's screaming at you, you've likely waited too long. And now you've got to take a different approach before you take long-term action.
Thank you. Laila, would you like to maybe add something on?
Maybe just one example of what we do at ANRU, and I think it's a great example because the territory is the West Indies, the French West Indies in Martinique, and we work with an association called ADVLP. It's a great association created after a disaster, the ouragan that faced this country. And the director of this association tell us and talked to us about the right to initiative to the population after a disaster. I think for us, it's very a great notion, and it's important to tell that populations can make by themselves they can make by themselves and have this right to initiate and to rebuild their district also. So for me it's a good example to talk about, yes, resilient communities and how they faced a catastrophe and how they rebuilt after that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Sorry, Ron.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to throw a couple of things in there based on what Laila said and what Nicole has said. Kind of two big takeaways for me are building community resilience requires advancing a sense of agency and choice, right? I think a lot of people make a lot of noise when they feel like their choices have been taken away from them. So I view resilience as like a restoration of choice and a restoration of agency that's been taken away or ignored. I think the second piece that's not talked about often enough is, particularly when I was at City Hall, I viewed my main source, my main currency, right? The best value that I could offer, the currency that I trafficked in was trust. And after the murder of George Floyd, and I would say, but before the tragic murder of George Floyd, we were in the red in that currency. We were in debt. We were below zero when it came to trust. And I think that's true for institutions writ large, not just not just city halls and not just government. I think there's a lot of justifiably so, I think, mistrust of a lot of institutions. And so if we're trying to build community resilience and longer term resilience, we have to recognize that trust is actually our currency. And so if we are in the debt, what can we do to make deposits in that account of trust so that we are able to then do the other things? The last thing I'll say on this is, because we were in the red in trust at City Hall for other things when it came to COVID and telling people to wear masks and take their vaccines and do those other things, they didn't trust that either. Even though we had never messed up when it came to public health, we messed up in other areas, which then impacted the public health question. And then when George Floyd was murdered, we were really in trouble because no one trusted us to do anything. So an issue happening over here can impact something else over here. And as a practitioner, we have to recognize that that's a big part of it.
Thanks, Ron. These are very important points indeed. And actually what Laila was saying about the hurricane and the example of the community rebuilding after a hurricane and extreme weather event Also, coming back to what Nicole was saying at the beginning, that resilience 10 years ago was mostly about climate resilience and climate action. And I was wondering, actually, how can you, in your own constituency, make the bridge between this climate resilience and the social justice and social resilience? How do you make these work together?
I'll jump right in on that one because I think it goes back to putting that agency back in the hands of your community and looking at, really attacking a challenge as comprehensive as the global climate crisis. One government can't do it. One city, one state, one nation. We need everyone. And so leaning into community and learning about our own history. I use this example in our community. The entire region of El Paso was populated by Pueblo Native Americans 300 years ago. Okay. If we go back to the lessons of our people, of our ancestors, of our culture, we start to understand better how to exist in an urban desert environment. So I think that I get a lot of eye rolls when I talk about approaching climate action through the lens of people and culture, but that's really how we start to, chip away at this and learn from ourselves, learn from our history, and build our future on that solid foundation. If we try to do it based on, prescriptive and isolated policy, I think we fail. And I think we've seen that. I mean, where are we today in 2023? This isn't the first time we heard of the climate crisis. So I think that's what we're missing.
I'll piggyback on that. Part of making, I appreciate that, Nicole, part of building that bridge is, and I don't mean to offend anybody when I say this next, but I think, similar to 10 years ago with resilience being mostly about climate, I make the case that the environmental movement, whether it was scientists, academics, data, et cetera, I think made a huge mistake by shaping the climate crisis as an environmental issue. Mm-hmm. It is, but the environment's going to be fine. Like the planet Earth will be here. We're the ones who are going to suffer. So the climate crisis really is a human issue because of the impacts that are experienced by humans and the things that we're doing as humans to the environment. And so I say that to say, it's hard for people to think about green buildings and green roofs and spaces and stormwater management when they're having a hard time paying their bills, or the price of gas is sky high because of what's going on in the markets, or they're unable to get the supplies and the groceries that they're used to getting at the store because the water in the canals is too low for the cargo ships to get in there, right? I mean, or the price of their coffee is going up because of wildfires or droughts in Brazil and other parts of the world. We have to do a much better job of connecting these real environmental and climate impacts to how humans are living every single day. And if we can't meet people's basic needs, it's hard to think about something as esoteric as the environment, right? And like, how do we get back to more of a narrative conversation versus a data-driven or a solely environmental discussion that really hasn't engaged and marshaled the will of the people in the ways that we need for real climate action.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Ron. And I have a question actually for Nicole that was asked through the Q&A. The question is, could you maybe share policies by El Paso to address social justice? So maybe one or two concrete examples.
That's a good question. I think that the answer is that we're still working on it. There's a couple of things. I would start with a core pillar of our resilience strategy that we released in 2018 was called Empowering El Pasoans. And so it was this, at the time in 2018, it was looked upon, that pillar was looked upon, it was even called like the fluffy pillar, right? This is the fluff. This is the, okay, we're going to have some conversations and tell people, how we're going to address these issues. No, Empowering El Pasoans was a policy-driven action to engage and enhance understanding of how to interact with government, right? To Ron's point earlier, if you've allowed someone to get to the point of protest, that means they've been frustrated every moment before that. And so Empowering El Paso was about restructuring city systems so that El Pasoans could more easily understand how to affect the change they wanted to see. And so I think that's one example. Another example I would say is how we have really embraced the challenge of human migration through our community. We are in the process of standing up a resilience hub that allows us to embrace families, individuals, anyone that is crossing into our community and assist them. But we also understand that there is a place and a role for that same hub in the in-between times, where we can lean into the needs of our own people and really start to not look at folks that are experiencing homelessness or folks that are experiencing mental health issues and need assistance as just vulnerable, but rather just needing a little help. And so I think that we're investing in those things. I would like to actually, if I can be very direct about the question, I'd like to see some more hard policy. It's very, very difficult because we also grapple with being a part of the state of Texas. And Texas is not incredibly friendly to social justice policies at the city level. And so those are the things that we start to have to fight with and fight against as cities, is the rules that we have to adhere to. But I'd like to see more of that.
Thanks. Well noted, Nicole. And I have one question also for Laila. In your experience in France and overseas, actually, how can cities ensure that resilience initiatives are sustainable in the long term, both environmentally and in terms of social justice?
Good question. It's a bit hard, but I think we could not have a great resilient urban project without including the human beings and in all the projects. ANRU works a lot to demolish, reconstruct the building, but also we have to include the access on education, the employment, the improving the restful living for the families, and also to have a real economic development of the suburbs, access to and all these things related to not just the urban project, but also all the point of the life of people. So I think if we don't have an integrated approach of resilience in all the projects, it could not work. And ANRU is and the national programs and ANRU is an instrument of exception policies because it's two programs, it's a budget, and after that it will not have ANRU after that. So it's important to have all the other policies of France targeting this kind of problematic of human being.
Thanks, Laila. I think there's one more, actually a few questions in the Q&A. Ron, if you want to take one.
I will, and I know that Nicole's answering one of them via typing, but Catherine asks, how do you deal with change in municipal government to continue with your efforts that are so progressive and so needed? I'll kick it off, and then I'll let Nicole finish it. It's a great question, and I guess one way to look at it is, when we think about change in municipal government, are we thinking about administrative change, right? I know there's a lot of CROs that have experienced a change in mayoral administration and mayoral priorities. And one of the things that was helpful for me, at least, when there were transitions in government, or transitions in hiring or what have you, was to embed resilience principles in things that are already existing. So like, yes, I'm looking at resilience policy, but I'm also looking at budgets and how can I embed spending allocations and direct investments in resilience in a budget, because we're, once that budget's passed and signed, we're committed to doing that one way or the other. And even more at a more philosophical and theoretical level, as we all know, budgets are a reflection of values, right? Budgets are moral documents, not financial documents. And so even being able to influence the folks who are putting together budgets to shift towards more of a again, human-centered approach, an approach that'll build longer-term resilience. Another thing that we did from a budget perspective was we had a pilot for participatory budgeting. So part of resilience is offering solutions that help solve multiple problems at one time. And so if we know that one of the problems was, hey, as a community, we don't feel listened to, we don't feel like we have agency over the choices that are made in government. There's a lot of decisions made about us, without us. We can think about that and say, okay, one way to address that is let's set aside some money in the budget for community to completely direct and control. One, we can test to see if that works, which I would argue that it does. Two, we can start to address the idea that people aren't listening. And so how do we, at the very least, put our money where our mouth is and say, all right, here's a set of money, which is your money. You all decide what to do with it and see what happens. And we saw some pretty cool projects come as a result. And so that's one way that I would look at that. Nicole, I'll let you wrap that one up.
No, I think you're right. And I'm glad that you touched on budget, because my answer to the question is that there really is no single policy or practice that can, take a community forward in a comprehensive way, dealing with, really changing something. I'm on my third mayor, fourth council shift, and third presidential administration. And then on the presidential side, it's been like this. And so you really have to, at the local level, be responsible for the impact. It's one of the reasons why I work in municipal government, is that when you make change at the municipal level, you see it. I make the change, I see the change happen. I see the impact with my people. When you work at the federal or state level, it could take 5 or 6 years before a policy actually trickles down to, the people that are actually affected by it. And so I think that you have to take a look at how are you embedding the principles of things like resilience, sustainability, equity, inclusivity. These are not, these are principles. They're not the things that you're working on. And one of the things that agitates me a lot, and it's funny because I'm a chief resilience officer, is that we've all gotten really wrapped up in a whole lot of chief titles. You got chief resilience officers, chief equity officers, chief heat officers, chief, I don't know what, like there's all of these chiefs. They get placed in city government in a position, they get no support. They're not included in the budget. And so it feels optical only. And that is so thin, and it won't affect change in the long run. And so I think that what we've got to start looking at is embedding those principles into the DNA of how you govern at a city level. And it does start with the budget. And I won't go into this too much, but Ron, you and I need to have a cocktail and talk about community budgeting.
Yes.
Because while I agree that the community should drive, I have, and maybe this could have been in government now a decade, is that you have to make sure that the community has all of the information and all of the tools and the understanding. Because if I handed a total budget to a group of folks that chose to engage, and I say choose to engage, because when we call people into a community meeting or a session or a collaborative, we are getting the usual suspects. And what I'm going to get is spend 90% of the city budget filling potholes. Potholes, 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 and more potholes. And I will tell you what, potholes are not the problem. How much rain is flooding onto our streets, how little shade we have, how much heat there is, how little investment there has been in some of the most impoverished areas of our, those are the things that we need to invest in. But if I don't give my community the information, if I don't share that in a consistent way, the budget that would get driven wouldn't result in the kind of resilience we're talking about. So it's just an extremely complex question, but it begins with embedding those principles in how you operate as a city government. And if you do that in a strategic plan, in your budgeting process, in policies across the board, and not just in one department, you will survive change of administration. You will survive the partisanship. I'm a blue city in a red state, and I don't know how that translates globally. It just means I'm in a very partisan position. And at the end of the day, that can't matter. I can't allow it to matter because my people matter. And what we do consistently is what will affect that change.
I think that's right. I mean, that principle of consistency when it comes to resilience, right? That it's not a one-shot policy or one-shot effort to shape a budget. It's how do we bring people along a journey, right? How do we both educate, but also as we're bringing along a journey, we're building that trust. So they recognize that, yes, filling potholes are annoying and they keep busting up my tires. In Minneapolis, we get them because we have so much salt on the roads to deal with the ice and the snow. However, if we dealt with these broader challenges of too much heat, the rain, too much rainwater, right? No coverage, et cetera. Then, we start to see the reduction of those potholes. But we're not gonna get there without that, and also without intentionally bringing people into the conversation, because self-selection is a privilege. If you have the time to show up to a community meeting, you have the time to show up to City Hall, you have the time to be reading these documents and all that stuff. That's a privilege. And so, as practitioners, how do we be intentional about who we're inviting in? I know we are running short on time, and I will take the privilege to extend our conversation just a little bit in closing. And so I will offer up quickly Laila, last words, then I'll shift to Nicole with last words, and then I will conclude our conversation. So Laila, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ron. Maybe, yes, as I say, our work at ANRU, we have to get out the exception to the exception and to find the ordinary law of what I say, and yes, to work to more resilient communities and work also to education, employment, and social justice. So with our new approach called resilient neighborhood, I think we have the good path to work on that and for the next years at the agency.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much
very much.
Laila, it was fantastic to meet you virtually. I hope one day I have the opportunity to meet you in person.
Me too.
I want to say how grateful I am, not just to be here today, but grateful to have been part of this amazing work globally for almost a decade. When I first started in 2014, I remember thinking, with all of the cities around the world that were convening, that were convened at that time by the Rockefeller Foundation, I thought, how are we going to translate action in El Paso, Texas versus action and challenge in Paris, France, right? I had trouble, even with my mind as open as it can be. I was very overwhelmed by that. But what I will share with you all is this: we have more in common than we have different. There is so much to be learned from each other. And I think that the more we can come together and share in this kind of a forum, the more we can visit each other and share those best practices. That was always the value of that network. We did a lot of really cool things, and there was a lot of cool projects. The best thing we ever did was put the brilliant minds of the world in the same room, and we tackled each other's challenges. And I'll close by talking about a convening we did in Mexico City, where it was the first time we ever had all 100 together. And we put us in a room, and at the time in Mexico City, they were dealing with the placement of an airport project, right? They put 100 resilience officers in the room, and we all put our brains on that project. And we all talked about the challenge that they were dealing with. And we brought our expertise to them. Sometimes the best learning you can do is through helping someone else through their challenges. And if we can remember that as a resilient city network, I think that we will prosper and we will affect change globally. And so I look forward to meeting you all in person. Ron, I look forward to seeing you again, my friend, soon, I hope. And I just, again, thank you for allowing El Paso to be at this table. We're too often forgotten. And also representing Ciudad Juarez. So happy to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Laila. Thank you, Nicole. In closing, and Camille, thank you so much, and OECD for joining us for this conversation and your facility.
Thank you. Thank you.
On this. And as Nicole was saying, this is what these cities on the front line discussions are about. How do we bring people from different parts of the world to share knowledge, share expertise, learn from each other, and beyond learning from each other, really get inspired by each other to continue to do this work, because this work is not easy from any vantage point that we're looking at. And so I'd like to thank our partners for sponsoring and for joining us today. I'd like to thank you all and our audience for engaging in this conversation and for your great questions. One thing that I like to do on these sessions, right, as a moderator from month to month, is I want to engage you all as an audience for the sorts of topics that we'd like to talk about. I can sit in a room with a bunch of smart people and come up with the topics and present them, or I can listen to the folks who are going through the work day to day. And if there's something that we want to elevate, or there's something that we want to learn about, please reach out to us at the Resilient Cities Network so that we can get a topic lined up and we can find some speakers and have an engaging discussion. I'll leave you all with this. Our next conversation is going to be on smart communications, and I believe that will be on October 26th. And so stay tuned in your inboxes and our website for more discussion. And in closing, I will say, I can't think of anything more important in the process of building resilience than centering human beings and human beings' lives in our conversation. We can talk about green buildings, we can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about water, we can talk about air, we can talk about heat. All of those things impact real people. And so I don't think we'll ever go wrong by prioritizing human beings in any of our resilient strategies, prioritizing their agency, prioritizing their collective and individual brilliance, and ultimately centering them in the conversation and in the planning. So again, much appreciated. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next month. Take care.